Laurie Spencer is the independent journalist, author, and radio personality, and a good friend of the show. Welcome, Laurie, back to the mother of all talk shows. It's been too long. Just before we go on to our mutual interest in the candidature of Robert Kennedy, let me ask you how this attack on the Kremlin is playing in the United States. Is it getting any coverage? Is it getting any traction? Anybody going, oh my goodness, there'll be trouble now? Or is it just another news event that has flashed by?
Honestly, the silence is deafening. I mean, the people are paying attention. I got a very rude awakening this morning when I saw the fire over the Kremlin. But from our government, strangely silent.
It's very odd, really, isn't it? Because this could, if this had succeeded, God forbid, if Putin had been killed in this attack, what do they think would have been the Russian reaction to
what do you
the
think's going to happen
decapitation of their country? They think he would have been replaced by a liberal throwing sweets at them, or that he would have been replaced by someone in a state of patriotic fervor, determined to make this war far worse than it already is.
And to do this so close to Victory Day is a strike at the heart of the Russian people, and they know it. And if we, the West, had anything to do with this horror, shame on us. They were our allies in World War II. I would like to remind everybody that we used to be very good friends. We were on the same side. We defeated Nazi Germany together, and we can't even honor them on Victory Day and let them have their day of celebration. It's unconscionable to me, George.
Did Donald Trump say anything about it? I know that Blinken said he absolutely could not confirm it, and other panegyrics like that. But you would have expected Trump, although he's in Scotland rather than the US, to have made a comment. Has he?
I have not heard a comment yet from President Trump or Biden or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or any other presidential candidate yet. I think they're waiting until we get more information to say something.
Well, let's move on to him, and let's start with a negative. Somebody brought to my attention, no doubt you already knew, but I didn't, some of the atrocious ways in which Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was joining in on the Russiagate hoax when Donald Trump was elected. He several times, I've read them, made completely false statements about Russia's role in defeating Hillary Clinton and thereby electing Donald Trump. Does that make you think twice about the rather full-throated support you've been giving him?
I'm aware of that. I think that was from 2018, back at the height of Russiagate. Unfortunately, it seems that Kennedy fell for that nonsense, and I can't excuse that, nor will I. But I will say this about my personal knowledge of Kennedy. I've known him for 16 years, as you can see from these pictures, back before he had gray hair. That was a long time ago. I tried to draft this guy. I was involved in a Draft Kennedy campaign back in 2007, George. We were trying to get him to run, after 8 years of Bush. I felt that he was the best man to save America. But the time wasn't right then. His children were still quite young. His wife at the time wasn't supportive. And let's be honest, the momentum of Barack Obama was unstoppable back then. But I'll say this, George. Back then, Bobby was endorsing Hillary Clinton in that race. He's been a longtime friend of Hillary's, endorsed her again in 2016, something I'm not very happy about. But, he's been surrounded all his life by Democratic Party operatives. And he's been most of his life a good Democrat. But I can tell you, and I wish we had time. If you want, I'll give you the short version of Bobby's red pilling. You know, he has awakened to a great many things in recent years. I can tell you 15 years ago, when I tried to discuss the assassination of his uncle with him, he didn't want to talk about it. I tried and tried and tried to get him to look at the evidence about his own father's murder, because I don't believe that Sirhan killed his father. And I brought him mountains of evidence, along with my friend Paul Schrade, who just passed away at the age of 97 last year. You might recall Paul Schrade took a bullet in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel to his head and survived. And he spent the rest of his life trying to get to the bottom of what really happened that night. And he reached out to all these various members of the Kennedy family. He reached out to Bobby's widow, Ethel. He reached out to all of their children. And most of the time, Paul got the door slammed on his nose. They didn't want to talk about it. And that's always been kind of a thing in the Kennedy family, especially the RFKs. They don't talk about the tragedies. They always accepted pretty much without question publicly that the Warren Commission was correct, and that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy, and that Sirhan killed RFK. But I worked on Bobby for years about this, and finally managed to connect him with Paul Schrade. Once those two began to sit down and talk with one another, and I can tell you Bobby was very resistant to doing so, but once he finally did, and Paul Schrade was a very persuasive man, rest his soul. Bobby just spoke at his memorial service, I think it was last week. So they became dear friends towards the end of Paul's life. And I think that Paul helped to red pill Bobby about a lot of things. Bobby no longer believes a lot of the establishment narratives that he once believed. Now, I can't get inside his head. I'm not in direct contact with him. It's been several years since we spoke last, but I can tell that he's skeptical of our involvement in this war. And I'm not 100% satisfied myself with what I heard in his speech in Boston on April 19th. I understand he's a good diplomat and he's trying to be kind to both sides, because what good does it do in negotiations if you're hostile to one side or the other? I don't really see how we can have peace. And that was always President Kennedy's approach. Even at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, his greatest gift was being able to get into this, get into the head of Nikita Khrushchev. So I understand what he's doing. I understand why he's doing it. And we are in a new Cold War, George. And you know as well as I do, you're not going to get elected dog catcher unless you say mean things about Russia. It's 1955 all over again.
I mean, I too wish we had time to go more deeply into it. But just before we leave it and move on, I find it, and I have always found it impossible, even before you gave us the benefit of your experience there. If someone had murdered my father, especially on television, when my father was headed for in one case and already in the other, high political office, I would devote every waking hour of the rest of my life to exposing the truth about what happened. I have never understood the Kennedy family's reluctance to do that, even in the case of the Sirhan case and your friend Paul's evidence. Only a fool could believe that Sirhan was the genuine murderer of Robert Kennedy. He was shot from the back, as is abundantly clear, whilst Sirhan was never anywhere except standing in front of him.
In front of him. He was standing
How
in 3 feet in
how
front of
do
him.
how do you get to the stage where you're slamming the door on the face of a fellow victim of that crime who wants to get to the bottom of it? I genuinely don't understand that. Do you?
No, I didn't either at the time. It puzzled me a great deal. I understand it's painful. I understand it's personal. And there's another reason that we have to take into consideration as well. These conversations that I was having with Kennedy, this was back in 2007, 2008. And at that time, Senator Ted Kennedy was still alive, but he had just been diagnosed with the brain cancer that eventually took his life. As I understand it, it was always Teddy's wish that the family did not discuss any conspiracies related to the murders of John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy. And as long as Teddy was alive, the family respected his wishes. It wasn't until about 2 years after Teddy passed away that Robert Kennedy Jr. became the first of all of the Kennedys to say that he felt that there was, in fact, a conspiracy pointing directly to the CIA in the murder of President Kennedy. Now, it took him a few more years after that to come around on the case of his father and be ready to speak about that. But once he did, he hasn't shut up about it. He wrote a book about it called American Values, which I highly recommend. Great read. He really talks about the Kennedys' long war with the CIA that goes all the way back before President Kennedy's time in the White House. And he's been very vocal about it. He has visited Sirhan in prison. He wrote a letter to the California Parole Board recommending that he be paroled. That was last year, I believe, and the parole board agreed, and they recommended Sirhan's release. After 55 years, that man's been sitting in prison for 55 years, and he's in his late 70s now. I don't think he's going to be hurting anybody. Unfortunately, though, California Governor Gavin Newsom disagreed and denied Sirhan parole.
Indeed so. It's all the more courageous, given what you've just told us, that RFK Jr. is now striking a number of political positions which directly threaten the military-industrial complex, the intelligence security complex, the CIA, and so on. He's now pledged to pardon Julian Assange and Edward Snowden if he becomes president. A very significant and important pledge.
Finally,
yeah, even if he did nothing else, I'd probably vote for him on that alone. But is there any sense that he's placing himself now in the same kind of danger that his father and his uncle were in? In other words, are you and I, perhaps, God forbid it, going to be talking about attempts, at least, on the life of Bobby Jr.?
God, I hope not. But he knows the risk he's taking, without a doubt. I heard a reporter ask him recently the obvious question, what if they're trying to kill you? And he said, I'm not worried about my safety. So it's clear, George, that through this long process of waking up in his life, it's been a long road to where he is now, his red pill moment. I say better late than never. Sure. It's about time you joined us, Bobby. I'm glad you're here. But he's at that point. His children are grown. And as you know, his 27-year-old son, Connor Kennedy, has actually done a tour of duty over there in Ukraine with the International Legion, fighting with Ukraine. He's now back in the States, came home safe and sound, thank goodness. But he knew his father would not approve, so he didn't even tell Bobby where he was going. He didn't tell Bobby he was going off to war. He said, Dad, I'm going to be out of touch for a few months. I need you to trust me on this. I can't tell you what it is. I'll tell you later. And, after 2 months go by, Bobby starts getting worried. What happened to his son? So he's looking at credit card statements and he sees charges in Poland and Ukraine. And he put two and two together, figured out where his son actually was. So, yeah, I think that Connor had to do that because he knew that his father wouldn't approve. And,
Sorry,
we just
Spencer, we
saw
could
this.
talk all night, but alas, all night
Are
is
we out
not
of time?
available to us. How wonderful. Thank you for being with us again. Laurie Spencer, the independent journalist, author, and radio personality.